Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show of the Western Standard. It's Thursday, March the 20th. With me today is political consultant Yaroslav Baran. He's principal of the Pendulum Group, and he's been doing hands-on politics in Ottawa, in government, and out of it for more than 25 years. Yaroslav, thanks for joining us again at this interesting moment.
Always a pleasure to be here, Nigel.
Well, thank you very much for coming back. Look, it's a very interesting thing that's just happened in the polls. After 3 years of the Conservatives being like a government in waiting, the Liberals have now caught up, and I think they're even at about 37-point-something% in the polls. Now, we're expecting an election to be called any time. What just happened?
Well, I think a number of things happened. First of all, Mr. Poilievre has enjoyed a commanding lead in the polls for almost 2 years. And that was largely rooted in the post-pandemic inflationary environment that we had in the Canadian economy and globally. Suddenly, everybody was concerned about cost of living, cost and availability of housing. And these were really serious concerns as people saw that their paychecks were doing less and less for them. Mr. Poilievre had first mover advantage. He started talking about inflation well before anybody else. And even when he started talking about inflation, everybody thought the guy was crazy. Like, what? We don't talk about inflation in this country. And then it really materialized as an issue. And people recognized that, oh, this guy's got his finger on the pulse of, the needs of Canadians. So he then took off like a rocket and maintained a commanding lead. Now, a couple things happened since then. First of all, Mr. Trudeau announced his departure early in January, and a lot of the hostility, a lot of the anger was personally embedded in Mr. Trudeau. And it seems that almost a weight was lifted once he finally announced, okay, finally, I'm going to go. You guys win, I'm going to go. And so that took that took strain off the depressed numbers for the Liberals. And then another thing happened. Almost immediately after, Donald Trump, he assumes his new role as president of the United States and immediately came out swinging and largely against Canada, threatening a trade war, already imposing certain tariffs, threatening more tariffs. And that really created a bit of an insular defensive posture among the Canadian electorate. And Nigel, if we kind of look back at how things happened over the last couple of years, during the pandemic, in Canada and internationally, we were seeing incumbent governments getting reelected almost as a rule. Why? Because when people felt uncertain, when people felt anxious, there was an instinctive reaction to vote for the people vote for the people who are in power, because at least it was a sense of comfort. In the post-pandemic environment, it was the opposite. Inflation, supply chain problems. And the general rule was throw the bums out. In Canada and internationally, we saw governments losing left, right, and center. There's a yearning for something new. So now, in the Trump era, Canadians feel embattled again, and there appears to be a bit of an instinct to go with, stick with the guys stick with the people who are currently in charge. They're on it. So that contributed as well. And then, of course, you've got the honeymoon effect of a new leader, and Mr. Carney was just elected Liberal leader, and he gets all kinds of free media attention all of a sudden, and none of it was really all that critical. It's just free exposure.
Okay, I think you've already tipped the answer to my next question, but I'll ask you, what is the ballot question in this election?
That's a really, really critical discussion to have now. The ballot question right up until January was cost of living and inflation. And that gave Mr. Poilievre a distinct advantage. The ballot question now seems to be shifting, and it's shifting more towards who is best positioned to defend Canada, protect Canadians' interests in this ongoing tension between Canada and our biggest ally and trading partner, the United States. So far, Mr. Carney has been scoring some pretty okay points, partly because he is the prime minister. So whenever there's any kind of a response to the latest, the latest whatever coming out of Washington, all eyes, all cameras are on Mr. Carney. So that's given him a bit of a boost, and we'll see how that ballot question evolves. I think, given how things are looking and have been looking for the last month, the ballot question is probably going to stay Donald Trump, but it's going to be a mix because people still have not forgotten the impacts of inflation and a lot of the things that really soured them on the outgoing Justin Trudeau government. So it's going to be a bit of a mix.
So it seems that we have an electorate that personifies government in the person of the leader. There was Mr. Trudeau. We don't like Mr. Trudeau. Now it's Mr. Carney. He doesn't make us feel quite as anxious and uneasy as Mr. Trudeau did. And yet, if you were to go one step backwards, you would say, wait a minute, how do the Liberals, because we're talking about a party that is continuing and, leaders come and go, how do the Liberals, who have so trashed the Canadian reputation over the past 10 years, first of all, we were just a post-national state. We had no defining national identity. That was Mr. Trudeau in the New York Times very, very early after he had been elected. And then you see the trashing of Canadian symbols, the desecration of the statues of, for instance, John A. Macdonald, arguably probably one of the greatest statesmen of the 19th century, but disregarded in the country that he actually managed to cobble together, interestingly, as a reaction to pressure from the South in the 1860s, right after the American Civil War. A great man, but when the statue came down and the head came off, the government just said, well, yeah, okay. He was actually a racist, had to do with the residential schools. And everything that was great and good and powerful and strong in Canada was dismissed by the past government over this 10 years as being inconsequential or perhaps bad for you. Now, suddenly we get like in the 1860s, we get a threat from the South. And oh my goodness, we're rallied to the flag and called to arms and so forth. How do they get away with that?
Well, the Liberal Party does have a very strong survivor instinct. And what we're seeing right now is a very, very aggressive push by the Carney team to demonstrate that this is new. This is a new government. It's a break from the past. And they're doing all kinds of things to make that case. He slimmed down the size of cabinet. He announced an end to the reviled consumer carbon tax. Now, we can still have a debate about whether the carbon tax is gone. I would argue it's not. It's more of a superficial, band-aid to try to hide it more than anything else. But he's claiming it's gone. They're also saying things like we've stopped focusing on identity politics and we're squarely focused on the economy. So these are overtures to try to appeal to conservative supporters. And at every turn, they are describing themselves as the quote unquote new government of Canada. So they realize that they need to distance themselves from the Trudeau government, and they're trying to do that really, really aggressively. Question is the country going to go for it? Are they going to buy that line by the end? Because look at things like the new cabinet. It's 80% recycled ministers from the Trudeau cabinet, for example. Is Mr. Carney going to successfully sell the idea that this is something new? And you know what? Also, he's got a number of liabilities that have not been tested yet. First of all, he's new to politics. Yes, we can recognize that he's had a distinguished career and he's done impressive things in Canada and in the world, but he's done that as a technocrat. He's never run a meaningful campaign anymore in a truly adversarial environment. Running in a campaign when the spotlight is on and the pressure is on, you need to think on your feet. You need to often pivot in the middle of a media scrum. You need to have a thick skin. And we haven't seen that yet from Mr. Carney. In fact, so far we've seen some evidence that he's got a pretty thin skin. He had some pretty testy exchanges earlier earlier this week with some journalists when they tried to pin him down on a couple issues that he'd rather not talk about. Things like conflict of interest and moving the headquarters of his previous company out of Canada, things that are not going to look good on him in a national election campaign, especially when you're trying to be Captain Canada.
Yes, that was a remarkable moment. I mean, the CBC are frankly the friends of the Liberal government, as well they might be, and then to pick on Ms. Barton like that, it astonished me. It just seemed like a very bad first move in dealing with the press in the run-up to an election campaign. People who know and tell me that they weren't as surprised as I was. That's just perhaps getting into an area where I can't provide you a citation. But it was an odd thing to happen, and if that's the style of government that we're going to see, one more reason for Canadians, I think, to take a very close look at this man. But while they're doing that, if you were advising the Conservative Party, are you in fact advising the Conservative Party?
Oh no, I don't have a formal
Okay,
role with the upcoming campaign. Yeah, I'm in touch and I know what they're up to, but I don't have a formal role in the campaign.
So, okay, if you were advising the Conservative Party, and having just laid out what you've laid out, which are the advantages that the Liberal Party, some of us might say, have unworthily inherited, what would your advice be to Mr. Poilievre?
Well, number one is do not underestimate the anxiety, the fear, the discomfort among Canadians with Donald Trump. Yes, he has done some good things. He has announced some good things, mostly in terms of American domestic policy. But when it comes to the trade war, the tariff war, threats of annexation of Canada, and so on, people are really genuinely concerned about it, and so they should be. Tariffs are going to hurt Canadians. They're going to hurt individual people. They're going to hurt businesses. They're going to hurt entire sectors. So we cannot underestimate the anxiety that the public feels, and the Conservatives will have to focus squarely on that issue. This works very well for Ontario Premier Doug Ford. He called an early election. He wrapped himself in the flag. He portrayed himself as Captain Canada. I'm going to be the strong leader who's going to defend Canadian interests. And we've seen Mr. Poilievre start to do the same thing. I think that's got to continue. Now, if I could just touch on one more thing about Mr. Carney, though, Nigel. We talked about his style and his thin skin so far in dealing with reporters. But it's not just style. It's also a question of substance. There are legitimate questions to be answered about the fact that he, as chairman of the board of a multi-billion-dollar, huge Canadian business success story, Brookfield Asset Management, he moved under his watch, the headquarters moved from Canada to New York City, Donald Trump's hometown. He tries to dismiss that as, oh, whatever, it was a business decision, it doesn't matter, things like that. But in this climate where we've got a resurgence of Canadian patriotism and buy Canadian movements and all of that sort of thing going on, it's not going to be a good look for the incumbent now prime minister to say, whatever, who cares about, where my corporate headquarters was, who cares if I moved it out of Canada to the States. It doesn't fit the narrative of trying to be Captain Canada. And there's also the other issue of conflict of interest and asset disclosure. We saw him snap at some journalists for raising this the other day. Under Canadian rules, a newly appointed cabinet minister, which is what he is, has 60 days to disclose all of their assets. This is true for any prime minister, for any cabinet minister. And he's saying, yeah, sure, no problem. I'm gonna meet that deadline. Problem is that 60 days comes after the election campaign. So throughout this entire campaign, Canadians are going to be in the dark about what he holds, where he holds it, and where there might be conflicts of interest. What kinds of issues would it be inappropriate for him to be involved in terms of policymaking? He doesn't seem to think this is a big deal to keep this stuff under wraps until after the election. I'm not sure Canadians are going to agree with that.
Those people who follow it carefully will not. do you think enough people will actually lose themselves in the weeds of conflict of interest and investments and so forth? I mean, for a lot of people, that's way over way over their levels of interest.
It may be, but 36 days is a long time for the conservatives, for the new Democrats, and for the Bloc Québécois to hammer away, saying, you're trying to be Captain Canada. You moved the headquarters of one of Canada's biggest countries out of Canada, and you refuse to tell us where you might be in a conflict of interest. Those two twin issues could hound him for 36 days and erode some of the glow that he's experiencing right now.
We'll certainly see whether he's got a sense of humor or not, because if he gets out, and after the CBC question the other day, maybe not. Look, the other thing that concerns people out west especially is that although Mr. Carney's opening actions have been to cancel apparently the consumer carbon tax, which is great, but it seems to us a little strange that this has been like an article of faith for all these years, that climate change was the ultimate issue, and that all sacrifices to reduce carbon emissions were necessary, justified, and if they hurt, well, guess what? They were intended to. And now there's an election, and actually, we can drop that. So there's a certain insincerity about that, which many people have observed upon. But once he's back into office, is it going to then revert to all climate change all the time?
Well, you're quite right in noting that not only has he traditionally endorsed a carbon tax, he made it his own personal mission to try to sell the Canadian carbon tax model around the world. He's on record saying this is the model that every other country should adopt. So to do a 180-degree turn on that, especially in something of a gimmick fashion with this big ceremonial signing of this piece of paper, doing a prime ministerial directive, something that isn't really anything. It's just sort of a memo.
It seems like the Pope saying, well, actually, Martin Luther had a point. I mean, it's not credible.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also, at best, a partial elimination of the carbon tax. It's still going to be embedded on an industrial level throughout the supply chain, therefore still raising the costs of consumer goods across the country and on just about everything you can imagine.
So I'm going to give you the national unity question. If the Liberals somehow secure a fourth term, what would you anticipate would be the reaction in Alberta and Saskatchewan and right through the West generally?
You know what? It's hard to imagine. There will be palpable anger, I think, in many parts of the country, because this is, we can say the leaders knew, the prime ministers knew, but at the end of the day, this is a continuation of almost 10 years of Liberal government, and all governments have a natural life cycle. At a certain point, the public says, enough, like, go away already, we need something new. If they get reelected, and largely on the strength, it's a fact of life in Canadian politics, largely on the strength of Ontario and Quebec, there are going to be big pockets of the country outside of Ontario and Quebec who say, what the heck? Like, how can this be? And we've had it. So I'm a little bit worried about the national unity implications should this government win. But you know what, Nigel, if we still have time, I'll point out two important case studies.
Go ahead. Right we've got 3 minutes. Go ahead.
All right. In the polls, we're seeing a bounce for the Liberals. We're seeing a post-leadership high for Mr. Carney. But twice in federal politics, we had a similar situation. In 1984, the Pierre Trudeau government was deeply unpopular. He recognized it. He stepped down, and they brought in John Turner as the Messiah. He's the savior. He's going to bring back the Liberal brand. And you know what? Same thing happened. Instant bounce in the polls. They were neck and neck again with the Conservatives. But by the end of the campaign in 1984, they crashed and burned, and the Conservatives won, and they won with a landslide. And again, in 1993, Mulrooney was deeply unpopular. They brought in Kim Campbell as their messiah. Suddenly, the polls rebounded. She was hugely popular, flirting with 50% in the polls. But by the end of that period, by the end of the campaign, crash and burn, wiped off the electoral map. So that to me says that when a government is at the end of its natural life cycle, when it's time to throw the bums out, Canadians will, in fact, throw the bums out.
So we should live in hope, shouldn't we? My word. That's the best comment I've heard on this situation for all the time that it's been current. Look, where do you think that, we don't know this yet, but where do you think Mr. Carney will run?
Oh, geez, that's a good question. I hadn't even thought about that yet.
Well, he's going to have to know by Sunday.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm guessing he'll probably run. Is he going to run in the Northwest Territories? That's where he's from originally, but the Liberals have an incumbent MP there who may not want him to give up his seat. So, I mean, the most appropriate place for him to run would be somewhere in downtown Toronto, hanging out with his Wall Street buddies, or with his Bay Street buddies. That seems to be where he's comfortable. But I guess we'll see. And a bigger question also is, if he wins a seat, assuming he will, but loses the election, is he going to stick around? Somehow, I would be pretty surprised to see Mark Carney decide, yeah, I've decided to go into public life, and I'm going to stick it out as leader of the opposition for 4 years under a Poilievre government. I'd be really, really surprised if he stuck around.
Well, I mean, the model is Mr. Ignatieff, who in many ways has things in common with in his situation with Mr. Carney. Look, that is, thank you so much for your insights, Yaroslav. This is great. Will you just stay with me while I salute our sponsors here? The precious metals in Calgary. This episode of Hannaford is sponsored by New World Precious Metal, based right here in Calgary. Years of inflationary money printing and rising debt have decimated the savings of the average Canadian. Gold and silver are the only currencies that have held their value for thousands of years. Last year saw 30% gains. New World Precious Metals offers unique platforms to help you protect your hard-earned wealth. So check them out at newworldcm.com. Yaroslav, thank you so much. This is, I have a feeling we may be talking to you a little more often in the weeks to come.
Reach out anytime.
And I had to ask you, what are your plans during the election?
It's going to be staying on top of everything, trying to keep my clients up to date on everything happening in the election, and doing some door knocking in my spare time. My kids are already fired up as well. They've already signed up to go door knocking, and they've been put on teams. So it's going to be, we're going to have some fun in this election. They're all pumped to support Pierre. So
super good. Well, good luck, and we'll be speaking again.
You betcha.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.